Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy Podcast, a production of neonewstoday.com. I'm your host, Dylan Grabowski. In this episode of the Smart Economy Podcast, I sat down and spoke with Alejo Pinto, the co-founder of Pontum Network, a product studio working toward global financial inclusion powered by blockchains. In this conversation, we discussed people's choices to transact freely, building on the Move virtual machine and the relationships with the developers who are building it, connecting with different layer 1 and layer 2 blockchain networks, the suite of products under the Pontum Networks umbrella, building on the Aptos and other blockchain ecosystems, and so much more. Just a reminder, nothing said in this podcast is a solicitation to buy or sell any tokens, and that the host or guests may hold tokens discussed in any given episode. You can check out a disclaimer on neonewstoday.com. I really enjoyed this conversation with Alejo, and I hope you enjoy it too. Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy Podcast. Today we're joined by Alejo Pinto, the co-founder at Pontum Network. I'm really excited to get this conversation started because Pontum is working on all sorts of different VMs and connecting different blockchain networks. So how are you doing today, Alejo?
Doing great. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. I want to kind of jump off into the deep end to start this conversation off. And I want to talk about EVMs and non-EVMs, particular newer VMs. VM stands for virtual machine, for those who aren't aware. And in a world where we still have all the TVL and all the daily active users and all the developer activity seemingly happening on Ethereum and other EVM compatible networks, why is today now the time to start looking at alternative virtual machines to start building on? And is this something that will compete with or ultimately replace the Ethereum virtual machine?
Yeah, so my perspective, and I think many other crypto people would agree, is that fundamentally we're here for freedom, the freedom to transact with each other over the internet. And freedom comes in many iterations. And one thing that is not free is vendor lock-in. Being stuck and using only one language or only using one virtual machine is something that sucks for a developer. And therefore, this is a monopoly that the EVM has that we're trying to break for no reason other than it was first to market. And there's a giant network effect of being first to market. The EVM has become essentially synonymous with all of crypto, not only for Ethereum, but other ecosystems like Avalanche and BNB that came after it, simply because developers can easily copy paste their code and deploy EVM contracts. However, when you look at the history of the EVM, it was put together kind of last minute. So Gavin Wood and Vitalik, Gavin was the CTO. He's now at Polkadot of Ethereum, essentially put together the EVM as a way to have composable smart contracts on Ethereum. Solidity as a language is very easy to use. It looks a lot like a TypeScript language, so it's intuitive in how you build out business logic. However, it does have a lot of what some developers would call issues. So, for example, reentrancy errors. So having dynamic dispatch is something that had unintended consequences. So, is definitely good in some instances, but has caused issues like the infamous DAO hack, which forced the Ethereum fork. That's one Ethereum Classic and Ethereum fork. Also, there's no built-in upgradability. So if you want to do upgradable smart contracts for, let's say, integrations or even like as a transition to immutable contracts for decentralization, you have to use essentially a proxy, which can lead to obfuscation of how the contracts actually work. This is actually how the recent blast hack that was around $60 million happened, where the developer essentially included vulnerability into the original contract, and then through proxy contracts was able to obfuscate how the software was actually working. So the developer was able to essentially then use the vulnerability that was first put into the version of the code that was deployed to withdraw $60 million. In other languages like Move, the upgradability is built in to the virtual machine. So when you deploy the contract, you can set it to be immutable, you can set it to be upgradable, and then actually track a history of the upgrades for the contract. So Another big one is performance. So Rust-based virtual machines or Rust-based, are way more performant. They're built in with parallelization or concurrency at the virtual machine. We're integrating this now into the EVM. So you've probably heard of trends like the parallelized EVM. So you can run transactions in parallel, have, for example, two markets in an AMM or an order book running in parallel. Let's say AP, USDC, ETH, and Bitcoin USDC can run in parallel as opposed to being sequentially called on a contract. You also get safety improvements. For example, Rust is has static static type language. So as I mentioned earlier, you don't get things like dynamic dispatch. Rust in general is more performant for low level applications, like things that run really close to the servers, which fundamentally blockchain applications are. And that's all to say that people just really want freedom to build with whatever language they want, to express themselves however they want. So one good example is the difference between Move and the Solana VM. So the Solana VM, you probably heard that it's like chewing glass because it's so difficult. Well, Rust gives you a lot of expressivity to build contracts however you want. You can build the same thing a million different ways. And a lot of developers honestly like that a lot because they're not constrained by boundaries on how to use the code, and they can think of creative ways to make it more performant or execute in ways that they wanted to. Whereas something like Move has a lot more guardrails, which make it maybe easier to adopt for someone that, isn't a hard code coder. It's more intuitive, feels more like a TypeScript language, similar to Solidity. So people really like it for that. But then those same guardrails are constraints on how you can build out the code and express yourself. But fundamentally, people, going back to my original statement, is people just want the freedom. They don't want to be vendor locked into any specific language. They want to be able to come in and use the languages that they want for the specific use cases that they want. And that's what we're enabling. We want to build out a credibly neutral layer so that you can deploy with most major virtual machines that are popular onto the popular L2s and L1s, so that you're not stuck using EVM or you're stuck using Move or stuck using Solana VM.
Awesome. What a fantastic response to kind of kick off the conversation. In what you were saying, there were so many threads I want to pull on. But I do kind of want to take a step back real quick and just kind of get a sense for how long you've been in the space. You've spent some time at IBM and at other blockchain companies, but when was like the first time you heard about Bitcoin or Ethereum? And if you're like me, you probably just read about it and then overlooked it and years later came back. So when was the first time you heard about cryptocurrencies? And maybe when was the first kind of aha moment that you had that you were like, this is the place I want to build?
Yeah, I got into crypto back in 2014. So very early on, started looking into Bitcoin. And at the time, it seemed really interesting. I brought it to one of my teachers at school and essentially mentioned that it shouldn't even work. Just the fact that it does work. So for technically speaking, it's not too complex, just like ASICs running, random hashes to prove something. But the game theory around these adversarial parties essentially coordinating to maintain the value of something that is just arbitrary, like just bytes of code that are finite supply. And it was holding steady at, I think, like a few $100s at the time. So he said that it was really interesting, definitely continue to keep an eye on it. Kind of went down the rabbit hole on the economic theory of hard money and why it's important to have money that doesn't have an infinite mint button, essentially, like the US dollar. And that kind of caught me in and continue following it for a while. After I graduated from college, went over to IBM and then made my way into IBM blockchain and continue following it and then made the leap into crypto around 2021. But throughout that whole time, just read a lot of white papers in my free time, continued looking at it. I actually remember when when Answers turned into Neo. So I go all the way back to that time. But a lot of roller coaster rides. Fundamentally, I think the thing that stands steady is just Bitcoin as a store of value and as an internet of money. A lot of other projects kind of come and go, and it's really hard to replicate. One, the immaculate conception that Bitcoin had, just a fair launch where there is no central locus of control. So it really is like a decentralized currency. And then two, the actual utility of having something that cannot be stopped. I think Bitcoin's probably the only one that's truly state actor, censorship resistant. Like China has tried to ban it several times. And only makes it stronger. Whereas, I think some concerted effort from some state actors could probably take down most cryptocurrencies today.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Maybe the second closest, most decentralized network is Ethereum, possibly. But I think it's super interesting that you landed at IBM. In my cursory research of your background, it didn't look like you got a degree in computer sciences or anything super technical like that. So what was kind of like your landing point at IBM, and how did you end up at IBM Blockchain? And maybe could you just share a little bit about what the enterprise's perspective is of blockchain? Were they more interested in like private consortia chains, or were they interested in exploring public chains? Because I remember for the longest time, the narrative was like blockchain, not Bitcoin. And then all sorts of other sayings that have come and gone over the years. But I do think it's really interesting to kind of glean some insight from you, because it's not very often we get to talk with someone who got to look into the belly of the beast.
Yeah. So when I was in school, I was actually really interested in AI. My major was cognitive science, and I concentrated in computation. However, doing AI research is like super applied. So did more of like a tech business implementation of what I studied at IBM. Yeah, very interesting, the perspective, because I think just from just being conservative in nature, from being a very large publicly listed company, cryptocurrency, even today, right, is just something that can be either really good or really bad. So we've seen it even with companies like Tesla acquiring Bitcoin and then getting pushback on, the climate impact of it, even though it's like, I can go into why I think Bitcoin could actually solve climate change. But yeah, I mean, I think generally they're very sensitive to being able to jump in. Internally, there's definitely a lot of people, and most of the people that were in blockchain definitely really like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general. But yeah, the idea was to take that same technology and then apply it within private networks. So you don't need like the game theory of an asset that's worth something to coordinate people that are, could be adversarial. So like, let's say if you're within the same network of distributors and suppliers for Walmart, for example, you're generally not going to be adversarial. You're going to be on the same page. So it would make sense to create almost like an intranet where you can essentially have one database that doesn't have a database administrator that can go in and change records to track, the supply chain of food or the supply chain of packaging. So use cases like that made a lot of sense. IBM probably worked with most of the companies that were looking to do proof of concepts for blockchain. The way that most large companies work is they have an innovation team, and then the innovation team essentially has a budget every year where they're innovating or trying out new things, even if they never go into production. So there's definitely for a period of time sufficient budget to, try out everything. I think the hard part is that actually getting people to coordinate on setting the parameters for that database or that shared network is really hard. And then doing updates and setting up channels is more like a governance or coordination issue, which again, a token that's fundamentally worth something that people are coordinating to maintain the value of is like that perfect coordination mechanism. So for Bitcoin, for example, the miners need to expend electricity, and they wouldn't want to fork into like Bitcoin Cash or, all the other efforts that have tried to fork Bitcoin, because Bitcoin, the one that people want to use, is the one that's worth something, which they can sell into to continue, using electricity. So, very simply, having something that is, doesn't have a ton of rules, that is just relatively simple implementation to track one spreadsheet and that anyone can plug into. I think that's also an important component, where the permissions of, okay, how do you decide who you bring in, and then what channels you let them into? All of that is just a large coordination problem that, maybe like you can vote with tokens or something like that to like enable. But generally, if you just have something that's open, permissionless, anyone can join. It's a lot easier of a coordination problem because you don't really need to coordinate anymore. Anyone can just come and join. So I think fundamentally that's why public blockchains just work better than permission ones. I think there's still use cases, and for example, wholesale banking, I believe JP Morgan has a famous one where billions of dollars are flowing through for wholesale banking, where a bunch of banks can settle with each other essentially. I think there's probably also use cases for other financial applications, like for example, if you had a ledger of all the brokers for stocks, maybe something like the GameStop saga wouldn't have happened, where we would have had, instead of all these different spreadsheets that needed reconciliation, and because we had more shares outstanding, or we didn't really know how many shares were existed, that they had to halt trading. If you had that, essentially, even if you're computing if you're computing off chain and then just everyone's posting to the same ledger, even if it's a public ledger, so you can maintain privacy, just like proof of having the assets so that we can make sure that everything adds up to 100 could probably improve a lot of the processes that we have now and get us closer to T0 for settlement across institutions. And that eventually ends up benefiting the end user that doesn't have to deal with stuff like this. Same for remittances, for example. I think that's another really good one, where once you break down how the financial system works, there's so many intermediaries, and each intermediary essentially has their own spreadsheet that they need to then reconcile with everyone else. And, any errors there are probably human input errors or software bugs, where a blockchain just fundamentally fixes that. So it's just like a simple spreadsheet that everyone agrees is the source of truth. So, I think even though there's definitely use cases for permission blockchains, I think it's just generally easier for the public ones to work.
Yeah, I mean, so at the beginning of this conversation, you touted on the freedom to transact and the freedom to build. You just touted the benefits of a public blockchain, despite the fact that maybe private companies might benefit from, or centralized companies might benefit from privacy. And then there are ways to work around that, where maybe you can maintain an off-chain ledger, but then once a day upload to a public ledger that everybody can view. I would imagine that this ethos probably runs very deeply in anyone who's working on some sort of blockchain at a publicly traded company like IBM. So were a lot of your coworkers, your peers, do you find that most of them stayed at IBM, or did a lot of people have a similar story to you where they ultimately left and went to go work on decentralized networks?
Yeah, definitely. I think most people at this point have probably moved on to other things in crypto. It's just very hard to get through, some of these projects. I think one that was public facing is what was being done with Stellar. IBM was trying to do remittances that was going to be competitive with XRP using Stellar. Jesse Lunn was, I believe, the name of the guy that was, Jesse Lunn, that was pushing that forward within IBM. But yeah, it's just honestly very hard, because you might have the best idea ever and it might bring, a ton of revenue. But if the public or the markets just see it as the opposite, even today, right? We live a bit in a bubble where, everyone around us really likes crypto, but sometimes you step out and people still, for good reason, there is a lot of scams, definitely, and a lot of gray areas. But generally I think, I don't know, even Bitcoin probably manipulated in some way and whatever. But once you step outside of the bubble, not everybody's perspectives on crypto are positive. So it's really hard as a publicly traded company to really have something like this. Even even if you look at PayPal and Robinhood, they kind of yo-yo back and forth whether they like it or not. And I think Robinhood at one point made a ton of investments into it, and then let everyone go, and then made a ton of investments back, and it's all just correlated with the price of the markets anyways.
Yeah, no, that's great insight. I think anybody who works full time in this space, if they can relate with what you just said, whenever they go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas or holiday dinners, they'll just talk with their family and hear all the negative insights that people might have about cryptocurrencies, blockchains, whatever. It's not that hard to open up a newspaper and see some crappy thing that happened in the blockchain space. So I think it's fair to kind of provide that nuance. Just for folks who, our audience is generally pretty aware of what blockchains are and various different networks, because this is a protocol agnostic podcast. But before we kind of delve into more of what you're doing and what Pontum Network is doing, I do kind of want to take a step back and talk about the Move VM. So could you just share who built it, why it was built? You kind of already spoke about Rust and why that was kind of the superior language from a lower level to kind of use to build the Move VM. But yeah, I just kind of want to use the who built it as kind of a launching point for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. So very famously, the team at Facebook, now Meta, started building the Move virtual machine at initially Libra, which later evolved into Diem. The main purpose of it was so if you talk to Sam Blackshear, who is at Sui now, he was part of the team that helped build this out. Also Wolfgang, who's at Aptos. The main reason is that they wanted something that was performant and safe, so similar to Rust, but had the guardrails and intuitiveness of Solidity. So Move you can think of as the best of Rust and Solidity, where essentially you get all the benefits, performance, and safety of Rust, but you also get a language that's very intuitive to use, looks a lot like a TypeScript language, so it feels more like Solidity, and it has a bunch of guardrails and features built in. So a lot of this you can honestly do with EVM, which again is like why I think in the end doesn't really matter what you choose, is more so like, what you like using. So for example, Prover for formal verification is something that you can do with Solidity. You can pull in a third-party library and do formal verification on your smart contracts. However, the Move virtual machine has it built in so that you can just do this natively, so that you don't have to depend on a third-party third-party library. Again, third-party libraries sometimes are supply chain attacks, so there could be issues there. But yeah, I mean, essentially, I would say it's nothing entirely new. It's kind of like everything that's innovative is just taking components that already exist and then putting them together in a way that's more useful. So yeah, think of like putting together Rust, Solidity, the latest and safety innovations like the native Prover, and then putting it all into something that's really easy to use, so developers can just start building intuitively with Move and get all the benefits of Rust and all the safety features that were built in.
Yeah, I think before we move on, one of the key things when I'm like digging around and looking into what MoveVM is and the pros and cons and the things that differentiates it from other virtual machines is parallelization. So could you just kind of like maybe Eli 5 for our audience who like knows enough to be dangerous but doesn't know how to code what parallelization is, and maybe give an example of a use case for why this makes MoveVM kind of like a successful virtual machine for leveraging this type of like network activity or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah. The best analogy is roads. So think of a one-way road where essentially you're going from Miami to the Key West and it's only a single lane road. And no matter how quickly you want to go there or, how fast your car is compared to the one in front of you, you just have to wait for the one in front of you to go through before you're able to get there. Right. So, for example, when you make a contract call to an AMM, let's say you want to trade two assets or two different people want to trade two very different pools. So USDC ETH and USDC Bitcoin. You have to wait because essentially they're executed sequentially, one in front of the other. With parallelization, you can have the pools essentially run in parallel. So think of, a 2-lane road or 4-way highway where you can have these transactions essentially go in parallel to get to the end goal without having to wait for the other ones that are in front of it. To be a little bit more nuanced on the different ways to do concurrency, which leads to parallelization, and Solana VM has what is called pessimistic concurrency. So with pessimistic concurrency, you essentially ahead of time say the states of memory that you're going to access, and then you have to lock those states in memory before you implement them. With optimistic concurrency, you don't have to essentially predetermine which states of memory you're going to access. So this leads to performance enhancements because you don't essentially need to lock memory ahead of time before using it. So for example, like sometimes in Solana, you might notice even when there's no congestion that a transaction might take several seconds, depending on how complex it is. Whereas like on Aptos and essentially Aptos, you're able to, most transactions settle within a few seconds or under a second. But yeah, I think that's a good analogy. Think about it, single lane road or, 4-lane highway.
Yep. Thanks. I appreciate that. So since MoveVM, blockchain is only 15 years old. So to say that a VM is new is kind of funny because the whole industry is still relatively new. But based off of the work that you guys are doing, do you ever find that you locate some like critical bugs or anything like that? So do you have kind of like a close relationship with the MoveVM developers? is there a pipeline for you to share your experience as a product builder on top of it? And when you share these experiences, are you able to find that maybe there are some new features or bug fixes that are added to the VM?
Yeah, definitely. So most of the maintainers are actually at the Aptos team. So Move actually has two dialects, I would even argue. And now there's two different virtual machines. One is the Aptos framework, which is the original Move, which was being used at Libra and Diem. And then there's the Sui Move, which they made updates to it so that Sui has a dual consensus mechanism. So there's traditional consensus, which looks a lot like most blockchains. But then they also have consensus in the memory pool, where if you're only updating your own object, so an object within that address, you can theoretically scale infinitely because you're not interacting with other objects that other accounts or contracts are calling. So in order to implement that feature, Sui essentially modified the Move virtual machine to access objects differently from a central location. And a lot of people like that. It's not as agnostic to using in other blockchains, given that most other blockchains work more so like Aptos and don't have this like dual consensus. But yeah, I mean, definitely there could be bugs. There could be, as the Move VM is actually continuing to have improvements over time. New opcodes are getting added. And yeah, there could definitely be some critical bugs that get implemented, which is definitely something that people should be cognizant of. But yeah, we work closely with the Aptos team. They do regular frequent meetings on the Move, different people that are working on making improvements to the language, and then stakeholders like us to give them back feedback to learn more about the roadmap. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, most technology is built by a few people in a room, believe it or not. Even Bitcoin Core developers are only like a handful of them. So but generally people are conservative and careful and adding in new features, and everything goes through audits, etc. So but yeah, could definitely happen. It could even happen on Bitcoin, by the way. They're thinking, I don't know if you've seen on Twitter, but Udi is pushing this campaign to add a new opcode to Bitcoin, or like an opcode that was previously in Bitcoin called OP-CAT for concatenation. And that was previously removed by Satoshi. Still a little bit unclear why. I guess we'd have to go through his like writings why he removed it, but they want to add it back on to be able to have more programmability on the L1. But yeah, I mean, that could introduce some fundamental bug that just wrecks everyone. But who knows?
I definitely want to touch on Bitcoin's like resurgence in new developer activity and L2s and all this stuff, but I kind of want to relate it to the lens that you have maybe later in the conversation. I am wondering though, because MoveVM was built by the DM and Libra developers, and you come from IBM. So is this kind of relationship, was it started that like you guys kind of recognize that, hey, we came from centralized enterprise land and we kind of speak the same speak, but we have the same passions? Do you find that that's how kind of like this relationship was formed? Or am I trying to connect the dots that don't exist and pulling for straws that aren't there?
Yeah, it's a little bit forced, but no, I mean, when I joined Pontum back in 2021, that was still when Libra was around, and maybe it did help, getting in touch with them seeing that I was from a more traditional tech background. But generally, the tech team at Libra was very open with what they're building. Most of the technology was open source at the time anyways. And then that team evolved into what is now Aptos and Sui. So even through that, we've maintained a relationship. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting because I think they do, when you talk to those teams, they are very different from other more crypto native teams that you speak to. And it has both its pros and cons, I would say. But generally, just interesting to see that there is like a big difference of people that come from traditional tech and people that are, have been in crypto for, 5-10 years.
Yeah. No, Neo had a group of folks who were ex-Microsoft, and you could definitely tell like the values that they brought to the table, but also the different type of language they spoke, because they weren't, quote unquote blockchain natives or anything like that. So it's really interesting, despite the fact that I might be reaching for something that isn't there. So you guys work mostly with Aptos, am I correct in saying that, as opposed to like correct. Aptos and or Sui? Yeah,
correct. We mostly work with Aptos, yeah.
Cool. So Pontum has a variety of products under its suite. So maybe kind of like to jump into what you guys are building and what you're working on, maybe you could just at a high level share what the mission and vision is for Pontum Network, and then we can kind of like jump into all the different cool things you guys are building.
Yeah. So Pontum, think of it as a product studio, and we're developing the Pontum wallet, which is one of the top wallets on Aptos. We also have Liquid Swap AMM, which has 70 to 80% of the total trading volume on Aptos. And now this new product that we're building is called Lumio, and it's a way to expand beyond Aptos so that we essentially have the capability ourselves and other teams have the capability to not only deploy Move apps, but then extending that to any of the popular virtual machines. So Solana VM is another big one, and we're also researching WebAssembly. Obviously, there's a ton of other virtual machines, but we're having to narrow the scope to the ones that we think are most popular, where there's developer demand. And yeah, starting to break that monopoly that the EVM has. It's useful for us because similar to Uniswap, which has deployments across various chains that are all EVM, we can now also start to deploy without having to migrate everything to Solidity, our contracts and our code onto Ethereum, onto Solana, and essentially go head to head with incumbents at each of these chains while still maintaining one code base. So yeah. And then the wallet, we're also going cross-chain, touching back on Bitcoin, definitely a big renaissance happening there, not just in the L1 with ordinals and runes, but also with L2s where you're going to have the same ability of programmability. And again, a lot of these are going to be EVM. So this is why we're also scoping out how to deploy Lumio there. So we can also deploy our contracts, and other teams from Solana and Aptos can also just go and deploy. But yeah, I mean, generally, as I mentioned throughout the interview, I am more conservative. I think Bitcoin and Ethereum definitely are the safest and most decentralized and have state level actor censorship resistance. I think there's definitely value in these newer blockchains like Solana and Aptos. They definitely bring way lower costs and performance, but that comes at a trade-off to decentralization and the censorship resistance. So at the end of the day, it's important to explore these. Users just want access to the assets that they have in each of these L1s. That's the biggest issue, the fragmentation of liquidity. And then having the application natively means that you don't have to rely on bridges. So having these applications deployed as trustlessly as possible enables people to just, as an example, do perps trading with their favorite application that they use on Solana, but now on a Bitcoin L2, so they can do that with BTC as opposed to only Sol. So that's the vision. Essentially, deploy across various chains and enable people to use the assets that they want to use with any application.
Awesome. You mentioned that you guys were building in the way that you're building because you found the largest developer base there. So maybe this is kind of like a 101 question that can be answered with a single sentence, maybe not. How do you guys keep your finger on the pulse for where developers are building? Because GitHub repositories might not always provide like the most comprehensive, holistic view of an ecosystem and how it's being built out. So what are kind of like the key metrics and figures that you guys look for where the developer activity is kind of the highest?
Yeah, I think the most important metric, so people like to say, GitHub repos or individual developers, but I think the most important thing is venture-backed teams, because those developers actually have sufficient runway to build something. You can have 100,000 developers that have no backing, and it'll be very hard for them to build a sustainable project. Or you could have 10 developers that each raise, $2-3 million pre-seed to build something. And then those have a chance at getting Series A, et cetera. So I think the most important metric is, going into an ecosystem, talking to the major teams there that have venture backing, learning about their background, learning about their roadmap, and this is where I think Ethereum and Solana have the most valuable developers, where again, EVM and by extension, Avalanche and BNB and all these, because a lot of the stuff is just copy pasted, has a lot of the mind share. But we're very quickly seeing that Solana is overtaking this, or at least catching up. Radium, Mango, Jupiter, these are all, again, applications that end users use, and these developers are, very high quality and have sufficient resources to continue building. And then that drives other developers to then raise funds and then do integrations that are built on top of these other protocols. And again, that's I think the most important metric to track for, quote unquote developer mindshare. It's not just, volume of developers, but I think quality, and that quality is, anchored by either venture backed or just, funding for them to be able to build what they're building.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. So I've been covering the Neo ecosystem as a content creator since 2018. And during the ICO boom, you saw a lot of projects, not just on Neo, but other blockchains kind of raise their funds. And then as the 2018-19 bear settled in, their funds and runway got cut in half, if not more. And they weren't able to, what would have taken years to build out, they only had months to build it. So, as much as like VC is kind of a negative term when you go on crypto Twitter and you talk to like the retail plebs, I think it is kind of very valuable that you point that out. So when you're talking about venture backed and like Pontum wallet, are your VCs kind of like funneling projects to you guys? Are they making connections for you to be able to add support for new projects to the Pontum wallet? And then on top of that, how does this kind of compete with like MetaMask, or is it even a competition? Is it kind of like an or Pontum and MetaMask?
Yeah. So maybe a correction to my previous, doesn't need to be specifically venture backed. I think any sort of backing. So I think ICO or public sales is also a completely legitimate way. I think democratizing access to finance is also important. Like Ethereum did its ICO, and a lot of projects like Gnosis, for example, ICO'd at Filecoin, another one. But yeah, just sufficient resources to build. Venture capital comes with its benefits, like networks of other projects that they back can help be a pipeline for partnerships and integrations, future funding, et cetera. So there's definitely benefits there. But yeah, generally, I think it's important to, work with parties and identify, where it's going to be beneficial for you guys to have, positive benefits from each other. In regards to MetaMask, yeah, I think definitely could be competitive. We're supporting the EVM space as well. I don't see them other than through the snaps, which is kind of like a platform for integrations, entering Solana or Aptos or even Bitcoin. Because they're first to market, I think their ability to deploy new features or innovate is kind of like maybe tempered a little bit, or maybe just they've become so big that it's kind of hard to push new features without the risk or major repercussions from a new feature going poorly. But yeah, I mean, I think MetaMask, Phantom are wallets that we see as, competitive and we look up to as well. And hopefully we'll be able to reach, some form of similar traction. Yeah, we're, Aptos is like one ecosystem where we've gotten, sufficient market share, where now it makes sense to start expanding to others and continuing to grow the traction. Yeah.
Cool. Are you able to kind of determine the types of activity that Aptos users are leveraging the Pontum wallet for? Are you noticing that it's mostly for DeFi? Is there a lot of NFT activity in the Aptos ecosystem and therefore on Pontum? Are there any other kind of like unique use cases that you're seeing emerge from the work that you've done and the ecosystem that you work within that maybe Pontum might be building toward?
So you can see generally on Aptos where most of the transactions and the contracts being called. And given that, we're one of the most popular wallets, you can kind of proxy that. So most of it's definitely DeFi, some NFTs, I think, although sadly the volume is, relatively low. It's Aptos, I think, has there was like a post about it being number 5 total with Polygon and then Solana, Ethereum, and Bitcoin being above it. But it was something crazy like, 10 bips or 0.10% versus like Bitcoin having like 30% of the trading volume. I think an interesting one that hasn't been really taken off is gaming, where because Aptos is so fast and cheap, gaming, doing more on-chain transactions could take off, but there really hasn't been like a huge game. The other day I was playing this, hyper casual game on the wallet where, each time you click, it's kind of like one of those tower defense games. And, each time you click, it's like, sending a transaction, but, that's only possible in something that's like ultra fast and cheap. But there hasn't been like a major game that really takes off. And surprisingly on Solana either. I think there's like high hopes for, Star Atlas, I think it was the name of it. But it hasn't really, I don't think any of them have really materialized, which maybe just a testament of how difficult it is to actually build, a good game.
Yeah, I mean, also with gaming, if you look at like Reddit and you go to the gaming subreddits, there's still a lot of vitriol and animosity towards NFTs. You know, we kind of touched on earlier in the conversation about Bitcoin's energy consumption and how it's debatable whether it is actually indeed destroying the planet or it could be used as a resource to better allocate who gets electricity and energy and how. And when during peak and off peak hours that this energy is consumed. So yeah, I agree. I think that there's kind of more of like a first principle fundamental shift that needs to take place with gamers before we can get to this place. And maybe it's not a blockchain first project that chooses to build a game that kind of takes off. It's more of like a AAA studio that opts to integrate blockchain into its game. So really interested to kind of like follow along with that as well. So since you guys are building LiquidSwap AMM, you're really close to DeFi and the network. Could you just share a little bit more about what LiquidSwap is, why you guys built the AMM, and maybe what does trading activity look like? Is it meme coins? Did meme coins go crazy on Aptos? Is it tokens that were migrated from other networks? What does that kind of look like from your perspective?
Yeah, definitely. So at a high level, LiquidSwap is a constant product and concentrated liquidity AMM. Constant product is the standard Uni V2 X times Y equals K. Essentially, when you deposit liquidity, you're covering the full price range of those two assets. And then concentrated liquidity, you can set as a liquidity provider where to concentrate the liquidity around the current price of that asset, so you can be more capital efficient. So standard AMM. It's the most popular one. It's deployed immutably on Aptos, so no protocol upgrades, which I think is good. Just like it's a good heuristic for DeFi, should be immutable. And yeah, most of the activity that we're seeing is, so not many coins there. Only one project, only a few projects have launched, their governance tokens. So within DeFi, you always just see the main governance tokens there. And recently, a few meme coins, there's been like 4 or 5 that have done fairly well. I think reached like a few tens of millions FTV. But yeah, that's the activity that you're seeing on Aptos on spot. Another popular one, which does well, is perpetual futures trading, especially when you have really low fees. People are just doing these leverage trades. That's a team called Merkle, and they're building perpetual futures on Aptos, and you can speculate pretty much on like any asset. I think they have a bunch of meme coins from other ecosystems there, and you can use USDC as collateral essentially. But yeah, that's what most of the DeFi activity looks like on Aptos spot, is mainly APT, which is the main gas token there, and then a few meme coins and a few governance tokens that have launched.
So when I'm looking into Pontum and I stumble on Lumio, this is where I kind of really start to get my mind blown by the work that you guys are working on. You're talking about Solana VM, EVM, Move. You're talking L2s. Lumio was built on the OP stack. So you guys are just kind of like fingers in every different pie you can think of. Let's just start with why you guys built your L2 based off the OP stack. And what network do you guys rely on for the L2 to kind of like secure itself?
Yep. So what we're doing with Lumio is integrating into the major L2s and L1s. So the first iteration of this is on Optimism, where the OP stack is open source and widely adopted, not just by the OP mainnet, but other L2s like Base. WorldCoin recently announced that they're doing World Chain there, Mantle. So we're going to replicate that same process for Arbitrum, Orbits, for ZK Zinc, Hyperchains. But Optimism was, a good place to start. So the idea is that once there's a shared sequencer, the Optimism superchain is going to feel like one environment for the end user. So we're going to be sharing a bridge, it's going to be sharing a sequencer, and users can do effectively contract calls across these different environments so that it feels, again, like one being in one environment, even though it's horizontally scaled across various environments. So yeah, our goal is essentially to integrate these alternative VMs and just focus very narrowly on the virtual machine component, whereas we benefit from all the upgrades that are being done to the OP stack. Like, for example, the prover canon, which is, one of the most difficult implementations to actually maintain. So all the upgrades that the that the Optimism ecosystem is doing, we benefit from. Whereas we focus very narrowly just on the virtual machine, so that things like Solana VM applications and Move applications can then go deploy on Optimism and then be composable with other applications on Base, for example, or OP mainnet. So that's the idea there. We've actually also are deploying onto Solana. We have a DevNet, again, an L2. So it's going to be settling onto Solana. But again, this is going to be completely separate from the environment and Optimism. Think of us as just having these multi-chain deployments where essentially people want to deploy. So from an end user, from an application perspective, like LiquidSwap or Merkle or whoever, you can just now deploy onto Optimism. You have the ability to deploy on Solana fairly soon. Whereas previously you couldn't unless you migrated all your code to, you would have to migrate all your code to Solidity and Solana VM and Move. So now imagine having to maintain those 3 different code bases is a headache and then very difficult for, future upgrades. So, I think what we're solving is like a very pertinent issue for a lot of developers, and hopefully, people see the value in that and start to use it.
You might have already answered this next question in the response you just gave, but I think you're the first guest that we've had that is building within the Optimism superchain. So could you just Eli 5 what that is for someone who might have had their head in the sand and maybe haven't really heard of this?
Yeah, so each of the L2 frameworks, Arbitrum, Optimism, ZK Zinc, are building with the roadmap or idea that essentially other ecosystems other chains that are building with the same framework. So within Optimism, that's the OP stack. On Arbitrum, it's called Orbids, that they're going to be able to connect to each other so that end users don't feel like they're in all these different separate environments. So what's outlined is that it'll be likely through a shared sequencer, so that essentially you can have composability. So contracts can compose across different L2s, can do contract calls to each other. You'll have shared liquidity. So one bridge, I think it's called the super bridge on Optimism, so that there isn't, 10 different versions of ETH or USDC. The liquidity is the same, it's because it's going through the same input. This has this trade-off. So the benefits are you're sharing security, you're sharing liquidity across all these different L2s. The trade-off is you can use alternative data availability. So for example, if you're Base, you're having to use the same ETH1 data availability as OP mainnet and all the others within the superchain. You can use Celestia or, any of the other alternatives, which could be faster, but arguably are not as safe, so it could cause liveness issues. For example, like if Celestia were to go down, then, that would definitely cause issues within. So it has its trade-offs. The biggest benefit is that you're essentially sharing security and liquidity and composability across all these L2s, which are horizontally scaling. And then think of each L2 almost like an L1 that you can fill with blockchain, with transactions. So let's say you have, Bitcoin's like one example. Let's say you have Bitcoin, it's 1 megabyte of data that can only fit on the L1. If you go on an L2, you can fit a lot more information on an L2. But now if you have 2 L2s running in parallel, you can fit a lot more information, times 2. And then that goes, towards the end. So you can essentially fit a bunch of information on the layer 2 that then gets compressed and batch process. There's still competition to process that information back into the L1, but at least you can have soft confirmations and a lot of the processing happening, quote unquote, off chain in these L2s. And then these L2s will have composability with each other. So from the end user perspective, when you're on a wallet and you're, let's say, having a loan, using a flash loan or using a loan from, let's say, Aave on Uniswap, even though they're on 2 separate, chains, let's say Base and OP mainnet, it should feel like from an end user perspective, like you're on the same chain. So that's a huge issue right now with the fragmentation of all these L2s, but definitely something that, all the major L2s are working towards. But I imagine you're still going to have fragmentation between like Arbitrum and Optimism and ZK Zinc, for example. But all the chains that are built within Optimism are going to feel really nice and compose really well together. And then similarly, all the, chains within Arbitrum are going to compose and feel really well together. And maybe in the future, they agree on some standard to also compose with each other. But for now, I think this is what it's going to look like, essentially. And this looks a lot like Cosmos or Polkadot, where you also have, composability across these like heterogeneous environments.
Yeah, perfect. Kind of zooming out, we're nearing the end of our conversation. I want to touch on some like philosophical or whatever you want to call it type of discussion. So you guys are building on L2s. You guys are building on a different type of L1. You have dipped your toes into the water of EVM land and non-EVM land. So I'm just curious because non-EVMs are they have a hard time competing with EVM right now because there is that developer share, there is that user base, and all of that. Now, I'm curious to hear from your perspective. Is it as much of an uphill battle for an L2 that is a non-EVM as it is for L1s, or is it just like a completely different battlefield?
In my opinion, at the end of the day, it boils down more to the end user application, and the end user application is, for example, Jupyter versus Uniswap or 1inch. So Jupyter is somewhat constrained within Solana because it's not EVM, and then 1inch is constrained within EVM. But 1inch has more runway or more options to deploy because there's more chains support EVM. Even Solana supports EVM with Neon, right? So I think at the end of the day, end users is what drives developer activity. Like developers are going to build, what end users are using, or they're going to build applications agnostic to the language, right? Like when you use Robinhood or you use Salesforce or any other application, you're not thinking like, oh, which language is this written in? Is it Node.js or whatever, right? Like nobody really cares. You just care that it works. So I think similarly, we're going to see that. And, if you give Jupyter the ability to deploy on Ethereum, and you can now trade all your ETH tokens and meme coins on Ethereum as you would on Solana, you're just going to go to jupe.ag and trade whatever, right? Like you don't really care as long as it supports the assets that you care about. So I would think more so about the language being, the barrier to adoption or what drives adoption. I think what's important is the applications and then the assets those applications enable. So I think like a challenge for Aptos is that, with Move, you can only offer end users Aptos, assets, right? So once you're able to offer users Solana assets or able to offer users EVM assets like Ethereum or BNB or AVAX or whatever, then the end users on LiquidSwap can now natively use, their ETH that they have or their AVAX that they have without having to, bridge or, go through these things that are, less safe. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think it just boils down to the end users being able to use the applications with the assets that they want to use.
Yeah, I just had the Agoric team on the pod, and they call this chain abstraction, where a user can just swap an asset from chain A to chain B and not have any idea about bridges or anything like that underlying in the background. It just worked for them. They didn't even care what network it was on. So from this future that you just, or this world that you just kind of like painted for us, how far are we from that? Where are we, like a year away from this? Are we 10 years away from this, from being able to trade a meme coin seamlessly on Solana with maybe a governance token on Aptos? If you could take a wild guess, how far away are we from this future?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's really hard to forecast the future. Like we're always going to be 10 years ahead. 10 years, 10 years to go from wherever we are. Like we see that with self-driving, we see that even with LLMs and AI. So it's really hard. Everybody's working on it as fast as possible. It really does feel, it feels like a trope to say, but it really does feel like blockchain is the internet, like early 1970s, early 1990s, where things kind of work, but they're like janky. Like pets.com or, e-commerce, all this like technically worked back in the 90s, but the infrastructure wasn't there for it to be, widely adopted. I think similarly here, probably 10 years, honestly. And, in 10 years, we'll probably be having the same conversation. And then all of a sudden it'll just work and we'll be like, oh, okay, I guess we got here. But yeah, I guess that's my comment. Really no specific way to tell, but we're all working on it as quickly as we can.
No, that's a great answer. I appreciate it. So what's next on the roadmap for Pontum Network? You guys have a lot of great products and tools under your suite. What should listeners be keeping their ears to the ground for forthcoming releases?
Yeah, really easily. You can download the wallet and use it for EVM. So all the Ethereum and other EVM networks like BNB, Avalanche, etc. All the L2s recently deployed Solana So you can also use Sol assets for the wallet. And the wallet is almost like a leading indicator of where we're going next. So we're going to be deploying a testnet onto Solana very soon. So you can deploy Move and EVM applications and Solana VM applications on top of Solana. That's going to help a lot with the congestion issues that have been going on there. And then we're going to be moving on to mainnet, that iteration, and also the Ethereum one. But yeah, that's what's upcoming. And then that's going to enable essentially us and other teams to start deploying their Move and Solana VM applications cross-chain.
I love that. Pay attention to the wallet as an indicator to see where you guys are going next. Fantastic way for people to keep their ears to the ground and just kind of a reason to give people to keep playing with the wallet and to test the different networks that you guys are building on. If folks want to chat with you or get in contact with your team, what's the best way that they can do so? And what's the best way they can follow along the progress other than using the wallet, of course?
Yeah, just follow us on Twitter, Pontum Network. My handle is Sadoji Nakamoto. Just send me a DM. But yeah, that's probably the best way to get in contact with us.
Cool. Alejo, this was a fascinating conversation. I was really psyched to talk with you because you guys are building all over the place and you're building to integrate with various different networks, L1s, L2s, different VMs. So it was a phenomenal conversation. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us in the Smart Economy podcast.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, what did you think of that conversation? I thought it was really cool to hear Alejo's perspective about working at IBM and how many of his peers ended up finding their way onto blockchain native projects after leaving the enterprise arena. It was also interesting to hear how Pontum Network is building for a multi-chain world by leveraging its internal products, but also resources and tech stacks from other ecosystems. And I enjoyed learning more about Pontum Network, building products to abstract a specific chain away from the end user's experience, which will ultimately allow them to transact freely on and between any blockchain network. To keep up to date with the Smart Economy podcast, head over to www.smarteconomypodcast.com. And if you like the guests that we've had on the show, please consider showing support by rating and reviewing on your favorite podcasting platform. Every rate and review helps us get this show in front of more people's ears and eyes. And of course, if you're a NEO token holder, please consider voting for NEO News today as your council representative. We've proudly been serving the NEO ecosystem since 2017, and we'll continue to do so by putting portions of our council rewards directly back into ecosystem growth initiatives. With all that said, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Smart Economy podcast, and we look forward to catching you next time. Cheers, guys. Appreciate you.